Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club Library on a beautiful day like this. It seems to me that we should be having comfort food because we're in this beautiful dark room where we should possibly be having pipes and smoking jackets. But instead, we're here for a program. Oh, by the way, I'm Corleen Kraft. The immediate past president, and your president-elect are both out of town. So welcome to our program today, which is entitled Methademic, a reasoned look at the public crisis. Our guest today will be Mark McDonnell, who's the Senior Deputy District Attorney for Multnomah County, Rita Sullivan, who's the Executive Director of OnTrack, one of the state's largest rehab centers, and Steve Suo, a journalist from the Oregonian whose recent series examined the meth crisis in depth. And the panel today will be modified by Greg McPherson. If you would be so kind as to turn off your cell phones and other noise-making devices, we'll all be very pleased. And then a few brief announcements before we turn it over to our panel. Next Friday forum should be very interesting in this off year for politics because it's entitled Oregon's Own Karl Rove. That sounds interesting. Democracy in the Age of the Political Consultant. I remember when we had Daniel Shore here, someone asked him how you could get an honest answer or a good answer from a politician, and he said, turn off the teleprompters. So no disparagement because I've known Greg a long time, but so anyway, that will be next Friday's forum, and I would like to alert you to the fact that it will be held at the Benson, and the panelists will be Chuck Adams, who is the advisor for Karen Minnis, Lisa Grove, who's the advisor for Ron Wyden and Ted Kulangoski, Jack Kane, who advises Kevin Mannix, and Mark Weiner, who helped elect 80% of the current city council. And Mark Sussman, who's the editor of Willamette Week, will be the moderator for that panel. Should be very interesting. So at the Benson Hotel. Our Citizens Read book discussion group will meet on Monday at 7 p.m. And the author of the book will be there as well, Richard Ellis. The book is To the Flag. Our final Friday open houses at City Club will resume on September 30th, 4:30 to 6. Drop in for a little conversation with your friends and a little bite to eat and drink, a little cardamom bar, which seems to be the addiction of the City Club staff. And details of all of this information can be found either in your bulletin or on the website at pdxcityclub.org. Our sponsors this quarter are Kaiser Permanente and Nike, and we are very grateful, as always, for their support, for the support of City Club and for the support of the citizens in the state. Now, our program today is going to be moderated by Greg McPherson, a familiar figure to many of you. He's been a lawyer at the Stoll-Reeves Law Firm since 1975, and he now serves as well as the Oregon State Representative for District 38, which consists of Lake Oswego and part of Southwest Portland. In his 2004 re-election to the House, he received the nominations of both the Democratic and Republican parties, which I think is rather unique. He served on many civic boards and committees, and he has been a long-time member of the City Club. He chaired the research board, and he chaired 4 research study committees, and he also plays the bagpipes with being McPherson. In any case, he will introduce today's panel and will moderate the program, so please welcome Greg McPherson.
Thanks, Corleen. Let me start out by explaining the format for today's panel. After I introduce each of our 3 panelists, we'll hear opening remarks from each of them. And then I will ask a series of questions of them, followed by then an open mic for you to ask your questions. So please be prepared with those questions. This week we will not have a board host asking the traditional first question, so please have your questions in mind and ready to go as soon as I finish mine. Our panelists include Steve Suo, who, as you heard, is a reporter with the Oregonian newspaper. He holds a master's degree from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and a bachelor's degree in government from Oberlin College. Mr. Suo has worked at the Oregonian since 1994, starting out in the politics beat and later moving to the paper's crime beat. His 5-part series on methamphetamines, published last October under the title Unnecessary Epidemic, was a finalist for the 2005 Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting. He'll be followed by Mark McDonnell, who's Senior Deputy District Attorney for the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. He's a graduate of the University of Oregon, both undergraduate and School of Law. Mr. McDonnell has been a prosecutor since 1979. Since 1997, he has acted as supervising attorney for the drug unit of the District Attorney's Office. He's also served as a member of the Governor's DUI Task Force, the Governor's Juvenile Crime Reform Task Force, and the Oregon Meth Summit. And then we'll hear from Dr. Rita Sullivan, who serves as Executive Director of OnTrack, Inc., a drug, alcohol, and treatment agency. Dr. Sullivan has a Ph.D. in clinical psychology and has been a licensed psychologist with OnTrack since 1979. She's directed the agency since 1984. OnTrack is a nonprofit organization providing a wide range of substance abuse treatment programs, including residential treatment for pregnant and parenting women and their children, custodial fathers and their children, and adolescents. We'll first begin hearing opening remarks from Mr. Suo.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks a lot, Greg. I've enjoyed talking to Mark and Rita here over lunch. I first met Rita Sullivan about 3 years ago when I was just beginning to learn about the methamphetamine problem. And since then, the world has changed really dramatically, as you know. In terms of the meth problem, there's plenty of evidence that it's only gotten worse. But in terms of national attention to the problem, it's increased tremendously in ways that we really could not have imagined. A couple of years ago, a drug cop in California told me he thought the best way to deal with methamphetamine was to require a doctor's prescription to purchase pseudoephedrine. At the time, this was a pretty radical concept that pretty much no one was talking about. And in the past year, Oregon has done exactly that. And dozens of other states have taken similar steps to restrict access to the main ingredient in pseudoephedrine, in methamphetamine. And in turn, as a result of that, nearly every drugstore chain in America has switched, or at least begun offering alternatives to pseudoephedrine that cannot be converted to methamphetamine. Whereas pseudoephedrine was once considered indispensable, today you can walk into a store and buy Sudafed PE, which features in big letters on the box, pseudoephedrine free. Now, I'm not taking a position on these developments, but I think they show just how much the climate has changed, even in the past 6 months. National news outlets have begun running cover stories on the problem, and Congress is moving to enact comprehensive legislation dealing with the trade in pseudoephedrine globally, as we reported today in the Oregonian. You can read more about what this means for the methamphetamine trade this weekend in Sunday's high-definition Oregonian. Many people have told me, you've spent the past 3 years researching this issue. You must really be an expert at this point. And I'll tell you, I'm not an expert in the sense that Rita is an expert in dealing with problems of addiction, or Mark is an expert in catching the bad guys and putting them in jail. But what I have learned is a small amount about many pieces of the puzzle that make up the meth trade. I've been to California, Oklahoma, Georgia, and New York to interview users and police and social workers about the scope of the problem. I've talked to economists and scientists and politicians and executives from pharmaceutical companies and the chemical industry. I've been to Washington, Ottawa, Mexico City, Vienna, and Bombay to understand the international trade in pseudoephedrine and how it is regulated. I've spent a lot of hours at PSU's library reading government documents dating back 2 decades, and I've done a lot of analysis of my own on data that show the relationship between the supply and demand for methamphetamine. You can read all of this on our website, OregonLive.com. But what I've found, and many of you have already read probably, perhaps ad nauseum, is the following. There are many recipes for meth, but the most potent form of the drug currently being consumed across the country can't be made unless you have one of 2 components, ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. Most of the meth sold in the United States is made by large-scale Mexican trafficking organizations that consume tons of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine to meet the demands of users. Only a handful of factories in just 4 countries around the world manufacture these chemicals for the legitimate marketplace. It is a tiny industry by global standards with combined annual revenues of roughly $100 million. Successfully interrupting the flow of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine to Mexican traffickers can produce dramatic meth shortages and has in the past, as we showed in our series last October. Meth is not like heroin or cocaine, which are produced from agricultural crops grown across vast regions of Latin America and Asia, and that makes a huge difference. The federal government can succeed in producing shortages and has done so in the past with each incremental move to restrain the trade in ephedrine and pseudoephedrine around the world. And meth users have responded to such shortages either by reducing consumption or by quitting altogether. And this has happened, again, on a number of occasions over the past 20 years. Now, the reason the success has been so short-lived was that the traffickers always could find a new source of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine that the government had ignored. It's not that the number of sources is unlimited, but that dealing with the international trade in meth chemicals has never been elevated to a top national priority. Now, all of this may seem a little bit abstract, but the bottom line is that for the first time, we have evidence of a supply-side drug policy that can cause significant reductions in meth use and associated crime. There's been a lot of debate recently whether meth really can be called an epidemic. The Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, Slate Magazine have all weighed in with the idea that the news media have sensationalized the issue. And I wouldn't totally disagree with that, the Oregonian being the exception to the rule, of course. What we do know, though, is that meth is an enormous problem, and it's the leading drug of abuse reported by treatment centers in 17 states, and the number of treatment clients is growing in the remaining 33. And fundamentally, it's a problem that we know can be alleviated. So I'm going to continue in the coming months to cover how Congress responds to this problem and inevitably how the traffickers respond to Congress. We're going to keep following this story, and hopefully you'll keep reading.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark McDonnell. I'm Senior Deputy District Attorney for Multnomah County, and for the last 8.5 years, I've supervised our drug unit. When I started in 1997 in the drug unit, we had 12 attorneys in the unit. Today, we have 7. During that period of time, meth, when I first got there in 97, meth was a serious problem equal to the heroin problem and the cocaine problem. But obviously, since that time, it's gotten much worse. Oregon has the highest rate of addiction of any state in the country. In 1997, the Portland Police Bureau discovered and seized 24 meth labs in Portland. In 2004, it was 116, twice from the previous year. And the problem is not restricted to metropolitan Portland. It is just as bad or worse in rural parts of Oregon. Rural Umatilla County this year had the infamous distinction of having the highest per capita number of meth labs of any county in the country. It has had a lot of very negative effects. About 50% of all the children that are in protective custody in Oregon are there because their parents have meth-related drug problems. 75% of all the burn admissions to emergency rooms are meth-related. Now, from my position, I see the meth problem as a two-headed monster. There is the Mexican cartel that is responsible for anywhere between 50 and 75% of the product consumed here in Oregon, or the small, what we refer to in law enforcement as the Beavis and Butthead clandestine labs, which are responsible for anywhere between 25 and 50% of the problem. But what we do know is that these small clandestine labs are responsible for 100% of the environmental impacts that we suffer. And they are the centers for people who are engaged in other types of criminal activity like burglary, theft, identity theft, forgery, all those sort of things. And they're also the places where we are finding with alarming frequency children involved. And because of some of the aspects of this, many of these children are severely neglected, abused, and quite often sexually abused as well. The legislature, I think, took an important step in attacking this problem by, as Mr. Seau indicated, that removing one of the very important ingredients for the production of methamphetamine. And I think that that was a very important accomplishment. But we should not be fooled that that alone will solve the methamphetamine problem, because as soon as that source of methamphetamine is removed, the Mexican cartel will gladly move in and take over. And unfortunately, Oregon is largely dependent upon the federal government as far as that type of interdiction. The smuggling of large quantities from foreign countries, the type of intensive investigations that are required to break the cartel, and the contacts internationally that is required to prosecute those types of cases. Oregon is largely dependent upon the federal government for that. We are making our best efforts, we're working very hard, but the reality is we are essentially at the local level overwhelmed with the problem presently.
Oh, thank you for having me. And my comments are largely driven by my clinical experience, and notwithstanding the debate that goes on as to whether this is an epidemic or not. Just being the director of a program which continually watches a soaring number of people seeking treatment for methamphetamine with its attendant problems, which are very different and much more intense and much more dangerous than anything I've seen in 30 years, and support the notion that we have a lot to worry about, that this is the #1 drug problem facing Oregon, and it's moving eastward. And as it moves eastward, we'll get greater attention, I think, from Congress. Right now, it's a West Coast phenomenon, and we've been dealing with it in this state since 1990, but in increasingly larger numbers. The meth problem is of concern to all of us because it literally jams up and clogs our system of care from one end to the other. It is why child welfare is essentially in business. It's why our courts can't see people. It's why our jails are overcrowded. It's why our welfare systems are not pulling people off welfare as quickly as they can. It is just out there, and it's clogging our system of care. And perhaps most importantly, we're no longer dealing with powerful drug addiction that once cleared from the drug, the user returns to their normal level of functioning. We're dealing with brain damage combined with a very a compelling drug. You can imagine how that challenges a treatment system, which has been historically underfunded, and after the last few legislative sessions is in a critical condition. Meth is dangerous, you know that. It's cheap, it's easy to make, as you've heard. It's easy to get. I tell people every day, when I was in school, I wouldn't know where to go to get drugs. And now our children have to be taught how to refuse them because they stand still in the school playgrounds, and people will come to them. This is a very powerful central nervous system stimulant, which brings a euphoria with it and a sense of well-being that is very hard to explain. I've spent my professional life asking people about what is it that is so compelling about those feelings. And they define this feeling as the allure of this drug as being an incredible surge of energy and a sense of well-being. And you can imagine a lot of the people we deal with are system-dependent, intergenerational welfare recipients, poverty, which complicates the issue. But I want to make it clear that every day I hear from my colleagues about their friends, their kids, their brothers and sisters involved with this drug. And I think it's important to note that at my own Rotary Club, when I gave a presentation not long ago, a man came up and said, I lost 2 children to this drug. Now, there was a time when it was easy for all of us to say, that's not us. And it's no longer the case. And the reason it isn't is I think I could offer compelling evidence that once you try this drug, the majority of people will try it again. And after you've tried it a couple of times, you're on a slippery slope. Just to bring the issue to bear, my passion really does revolve around what happens to children in this epidemic. It is because I believe that there is no primary prevention unless the parents are clean and sober and raising those children in clean and sober homes. And what compels me to stay involved in this and to learn all I can and to invest the energy I do into the resolution of this problem are cases where children come up and say how grateful they are to be able to spend another night in a treatment program. I could give you the facts, but I'll tell you one story which I think brings it home. I walked into our treatment program for women and kids not long ago, and a little girl that reminded me of the picture of Les Miserables. She was a kind of wind-blowing, little frail, blonde little girl, probably 4 or 5 years old, with shoes on the wrong feet, 3 or 4 sizes too big, a coat in 110-degree weather over her body. Said to me, do we get to stay here another day? And I said, yes, of course you do. And she ran to her brother and said, Rob, we get to stay here another day. And that brought to me, it just brought it home to me that these children wake up every day not knowing what stranger they're going to open their eyes to, where their next meal is coming from, where they're going to sleep. And I think most importantly, what Mark brings up about the labs is important, that you do get exposure from that. But let's step back from that and think about the people in poverty who rent houses that would be considered probably blighted by most of us, because that's all they can afford. And in it, before them, was the manufacture of methamphetamine, so innocent children crawling around the carpet are exposed. But more than that, what about a child hugged by a mother who's been using? Whether that drug came from Mexico or Canada or in a lab itself, it's transported from the mother and absorbed into the child's system. Or what about a child breastfeeding and getting toxic from methamphetamine? And I think that's the part to bear in mind. I want to remain as judgment-free as I can about this population, because my instant response when I first saw it is, what are they doing? And then I learned I couldn't live a single day in the lives of most of those women or the men that we serve once they get on this slope. But let me end by saying this. If you have a powerful stimulant that causes you, by real neurological involvement, to seek this stimulation because it stimulates dopamine centers of the brain which are pleasure producing, and you're compelled to do that, and you use it, and at some point it becomes neurotoxic and starts killing those brain cells, and you don't feel normal pleasure, the world is gray, and we're challenged to treat that and say, well, you can live 2 years with that gray state, or you can be compelled to use this drug that makes you think everything is okay. It creates a huge challenge. So what I'm trying to do is to try to understand that if you have somebody using it, they call this a run and crash drug, because as you're seeking that euphoria, you use more and more to get the same effect, and you use for days and weeks until you can't use anymore. Then you crash and you sleep it out. In either state, you're a worthless parent, although you don't know it. And add to that you don't sleep, you don't eat, you're sleep deprived. I mean, that's who's parenting our children. So, and I believe that the only effective way to respond to this is treating it. It's good public policy. It's the most cost-efficient, most humane response to it. There are no other responses that work in the long run. And yet, the treatment system has been eviscerated until 70% of the funding has been taken out of treatment in the state of Oregon. We're not a treatment-friendly state. And we need to relook at that as a citizen area and look at how we can respond to this humanely and efficiently. Thank you.
As announced earlier, we'll now go to a series of prepared questions, and the first one goes to Steve Suo. Meth abuse has been a fluctuating problem in Oregon for over 20 years. Why did the Oregonian choose to focus on the issue when it did?
We have been writing about meth for 20 years. In fact, one of the reasons why we did start to focus on it was because I think somebody awoke one day and realized we have a meth story on just about every page of the newspaper every day of the week. Talking about child abuse, talking about trafficking cases and the court system. And no one had really put the pieces together. It was just sort of an accepted fact of life. And frankly, we didn't really have the statistics up until recently to be able to really quantify the fact that Oregon does have a more severe problem than many other states. The statistic that we used is that we have more people in treatment per capita than any state in the country. And that was staggering. But I will say, I think when I started looking into this 3 years ago, I've looked at other coverage by other newspapers across the country, and it's just the same. You see the same story told time and time again. Meth has arrived, meth is coming, meth is terrible, and yet, which is the first step, but nobody has ever really gone the next step to try and figure out why, and so I guess that's what motivated us.
Next question goes to Mark McDonnell. Narcotics enforcement efforts that focus on the point of sale to users catch those at the low end of the distribution chain. Is chasing small-time users and dealers of meth a good investment of criminal justice resources?
Well, I would say it's not the best way. I think the best way is to attack it at its source. The problem has been is that the law enforcement end of it has been cut so drastically that in the last 5 or 6 years we've been forced into a situation that we were just responding to the really problem areas that were so obvious that we couldn't ignore. A lot of what we do is driven by citizen complaints, neighborhoods, people saying, I've got a drug house down the street from me or down the neighborhood. There's a lot of activity in all drugs, not just methamphetamine, that is obvious that law enforcement has a very difficult time responding to, and we've had a real difficult time getting ahead of the curve. We've been very reactive and not proactive. And that's something that a lot of us in law enforcement have been saying for a long time. And I think what's interesting is that the people that are in the system, the treatment providers, the prosecutors, the police, they're all speaking on the same page. We support treatment. A lot of people in the treatment field support more jails. Jails are very important to stabilize people, get them ready for treatment. We can't even get people to court now.
Next question goes to Rita Sullivan. Is the effect of meth on the addict worse than other drugs or than alcohol, or has meth simply captured public fascination for the time being?
I don't promote the overuse of any of those. That's the first thing. They all have negative consequences. They all are difficult in their own right, and recovery from any drug is a very hard process and one we ask people to do. But having said that, the neurochemical changes that happen from using this drug make it difficult to treat, make people violent, often dangerous, and amotivated, and they don't perceive a problem, and they have thought distortions and all the things that go with that. So the short answer is it is difficult, and the contamination, the materials they use to make this drug and the contaminants in it make the response to it unpredictable.
If I could just respond to that for a second. They're different. People that use heroin spend a great deal of time just trying to find a drug so they won't be sick, so they can stabilize and maintain. And then after they use, a lot of times they crash. Cocaine has a short, intense high. The thing with meth is people go on binges that last for days, and they're just not sitting around doing nothing. They're very industrious people. They're thinking up ways to commit other types of crimes, breaking into people's houses, cars. They're on computers. They're involved in pornography. They have an insatiable sexual appetite. So it's different. It's not worse. It's just different.
Next question for Steve Suo. One of your articles contained quite a detailed explanation of how meth is manufactured from pseudoephedrine. Did you have any concern that providing that explanation could increase the number of home meth labs?
I've been asked this question many times, not surprisingly perhaps. Yeah, there was a lot of concern from readers after we actually published a graphic that illustrated the inside of a Mexican super lab. The issue, the reason why we felt comfortable doing that is, well, first of all, our intent was to show just how complex and how sophisticated these Mexican super labs are in comparison to a home user lab. And in fact, the point of the article was that it is impossible for an ordinary person to replicate this, simply by virtue of the fact that they don't have access to, hundreds of pounds of pseudoephedrine. It's the same basic technique, but it's a much larger scale. And in terms of what users would do, the basic equipment and the setups and the ingredients are available anywhere on the internet, and so there was a feeling that the explanatory value of this graphic vastly outweighed any marginal risk of attracting people to manufacturing meth.
Next question goes to Mark McDonnell. In the past, an asset taken by civil forfeiture in Oregon because it constitutes the proceeds or instrumentality of a drug crime could be only used for drug treatment. Under the new civil forfeiture law enacted by this year's Oregon legislature, most of the assets taken by civil forfeiture will be used to support law enforcement. In your view, is a dollar spent on law enforcement more effective in combating the meth problem than spending that dollar on drug treatment?
I think you have to have both. You can't have one or the other. But I think the bottom line is the new statute and forfeiture will have little effect. I really don't think it will generate very much money. I think it will be too difficult to use, and not many prosecutors will use it to the extent of the pre-Measure 3 civil forfeiture that existed prior to 2000.
And you may have seen this coming, but I'm going to take that same question to Dr. Sullivan. In your view, is a dollar spent on law enforcement more effective in combating the meth problem than spending that dollar on drug treatment?
No, I would never say that. I would say that we need law enforcement to help us create inducements for participation in treatment and to begin to stabilize them before they come into treatment until something more substantive happens when they're in treatment. We need that mandation, and that legal system and finding them and encouraging them into treatment is an essential first step in the treatment process.
Next question for Steve Suo. The photos in one of your articles show dramatic before and after mugshots of meth addicts with gaunt and pockmarked faces after a few short years or even months of abuse. Is there a risk that young people who don't see the same effects on the faces of users they know will decide that meth's dangers are being exaggerated?
The short answer is yes, there's a risk. Before I answer that, actually, I wanted to take a crack at the earlier question about the next dollar spent on treatment versus law enforcement. Just briefly, the interesting thing that we found was that these dramatic declines in the availability and use of meth that occurred in the 1990s were all brought about by federal policies, regulation essentially of the chemical industry that really cost taxpayers very little, especially in comparison to the roughly $700 million a year currently spent eradicating coca in Latin America. There have been concrete impacts for very little investment. And that's a very specific type of law enforcement, really regulation, as I say. But in terms of the risks of publishing the before and after photos, yeah, I think anytime you exaggerate the risks of using drugs, it does run the risk of turning kids off. These photos were real photos, they're real people. As to whether they are representative of the average meth user in Oregon, I don't know. The deputy at the jail who provided them to us certainly felt they were. And there's been a tremendous response from people around the country. We've published a poster now, which is going to schools, and so we felt it was a benefit.
Next question for Mark McDonnell. The emphasis of Oregon's meth legislation this year was on curbing local meth labs. Given that 2/3 or more of meth comes in from out of state, will drug enforcement efforts be shifted to go after importation, and if so, how?
Well, I think if we can get ahead of the curve, they'll certainly attempt to do so. In the past, we had a lot of drug task forces around the state of Oregon prior to the passage of Measure 3, and we worked with federal authorities. We had deputies cross-designated to prosecute federal cases. We worked on interdiction. It was all very important. The thing is that those types of investigations take a lot of time and money. It's really hard to break these rings and cartels, and with the Mexican cartel, it's even more difficult because there are a lot of inter-family relationships, and you have to be of that culture, and you have to be able to speak their language. And they're, other than the very bottom level, they're very distrustful of any outsiders. So it takes a lot of time and money, and that's what we haven't had to do in the last 5-6 years.
Next question for Rita Sullivan. How much can drug treatment accomplish for people whose education and skills are limited and who use meth for a psychic escape from poverty and boredom?
Well, I think part of drug treatment is to offer the hope of a different kind of future. It is not just the cessation of the drug-using behavior that treatment is about. We have broad, long-ranging treatment goals, which include reintegration and mainstreaming and being able to be self-sufficient and independent from the system. And I think it's important that people who can be advocates for treatment understand that we don't let go of people after 30 days. In public programs, at least, we keep them for the couple of years that is required for a lot of these cognitive reversals to take place, impulse control problems to recede, movement disorders to get improved, and goals for the future in place.
And now for a final question from me, which is the cue to our live audience to start coming forward with any questions that they have. And it's a question of some personal privilege, because I was one of the 4 legislators this last session who developed the meth package, along with Senator Jenny Burdick, who's in our live audience today. And that was, as you've indicated before, I've indicated it focused on local meth labs and a range of other efforts. I wanted to throw this question out to the panel in general. How well did we do?
Well, I'm totally grateful for the resources that will be going to drug courts. And I'm a strong advocate of them. I've seen the benefit to treatment by having oversight by the judiciary. We can boast very good outcomes, improved outcomes from regular treatment. So for that piece, I'm eternally grateful.
Well, I think the restrictions on pseudoephedrine was a very major accomplishment, and in face of very fierce opposition by the pharmaceutical industry. I think that was a very courageous move. On the same time, it was the cheapest way to attack the problem, but I think it will have a very dramatic impact. As I said, last year we had 116 meth labs in Portland. As of August 31st, we've only had 24. So I think that in and of itself has shown a great deal of accomplishment. Otherwise, I think there were some increased penalties, but I thought those were very modest. I thought there should have been more there. And I was very disappointed in the forfeiture aspect of it. There wasn't any real new money for law enforcement, and the forfeiture package would have really provided that. And so that was, personally for me, very disappointing.
I can't really give an opinion as a journalist, but I can tell you that I think many states like Oregon are doing what they can within their own borders, and there's been tremendous action across the country. But I think there's also a growing recognition among different states of this two-headed supply problem, and so increasingly people are looking to Congress to take it up themselves and fill in the gap.
And now we'll turn to questions from our live audience, and as always, asking a question at City Club is a privilege of membership.
Thank you. Tom Cox, City Club member. Mark, Rita, and Steve, thank you very much for coming. It seems to, I read that in 1998, Charles Manson, one of the most heavily guarded human beings in the United States, was caught running a drug distribution ring while in prison. If we instituted a police state tomorrow and put us all into that kind of guardianship, we'd still have a drug problem. It was heroin, then it was cocaine, then it was crack, now it's meth, in 10 years it'll be something else. Is there something about human nature that we're just not seeing, that we're just going to keep running in place until we come to some realization that we haven't gotten to yet?
It's my sense that if you look back in time immemorial, we've tried to alter our consciousness, and I think that will continue to go on. But if we do it in ways that are less likely to impact the people around us than methamphetamine, then I'd feel like we're ahead of the game in terms of harm reduction. We just can't have these things where there are innocent and vulnerable victims to your own need to change your consciousness.
Well, I would agree. I think historically there's always been a segment of the population that has been involved in antisocial behavior, and I think there's always going to be a segment of the population that's doing that. The problem is that there are so many other collateral aspects. You know, legalization I don't think is a real answer because of the impact that it has on children and other parts of society. You know, in a lot of aspects, we've almost de facto legalized a lot of drugs here in Oregon. The penalties for possession of heroin and methamphetamine and cocaine are very minimal. If you're not concerned about having a felony conviction on your record, there really is no penalty. It's presumptive sentence is 10, probation, 10 days in jail, regardless if it's your first conviction or your 100th conviction. And if you don't care if you have and we don't have any room in the jail. We matrixed 549 people last month from the county jail, so they know they're not going to go to jail, and if they get sent to jail, they're going to be the first people released. So a lot of de facto, and it really has a livability problem. But you could go down to Old Town or other parts of Portland. Nobody wants people selling drugs out on the corner or using.
Yeah, I think the difference between meth and other drugs is that, as I said before, I don't think anybody knows how you can cut off the supply of cocaine, but I think we do know how you can cut off the supply of methamphetamine. Certainly people will continue to use other drugs afterwards. Some meth users will find other drugs, but you have an answer to this one. And also, if I could, in further response to the question about the faces of meth, I think there are people who tried meth one time and never use it again. I think, I don't know what number that is, but I do know that there are far more former meth users in the United States than there are current meth users. So that suggests that not everybody becomes addicted, and that people can recover from their addictions. So I think it is a mistake to demonize or overstate the effects of the drug. But for those people who do become addicted, the effects are terrible, and the effects on the people around them are terrible. And so for that reason, I think showing the extreme case can have some value, because the risks of even trying it are so high. You don't know when you try it whether you're going to be one of those people.
All right, Kent Neff, City Club member. Hypothetical situation, let's suppose we had a drug czar in Oregon, each of you had a crack at it. Resources weren't a problem. What would that program look like?
Well, that's a nice fantasy to consider. I think treatment on demand is what we need. I don't think that you can be put in line to be treated for diabetes or coronary or any other health problem that has a behavioral component, and I don't think we ought to have people in need of treatment waiting on wait lists, especially pregnant women, and missing the moment of opportunity and moment of motivation. It wouldn't take that much money, and it's something we need to have the political fortitude to move towards, and as Oregonians to say, this is what we need to do. But I'm telling you, I have seen so many people willing and ready to come into treatment. You put them on a wait list, you've lost the moment.
Well, I would have to sort of echo that. I think treatment is very, very important, and we're lacking in treatment, but it's got to be balanced. We've got to have the enforcement too, because it's been my experience that very few people go into treatment because it's in their best interest. It's because it's the least onerous option available. And recent studies have actually shown that court-mandated treatment is just acceptable or more successful than non-voluntary. So I think you got to have it both. You got to have enforcement out there to give the people incentive. We need severe penalties for the people who are selling and manufacturing, because that's a conscious choice for most of these people. And especially when you're manufacturing, it's premeditated. There's so many steps involved. You really know what you're doing, and you know the risks that you're taking and the risks that you're imposing on other people. And I think the real key is the federal key. I couldn't echo that more, because we were so successful in the 80s and 90s with P2P, which was the primary precursor substance prior to pseudoephedrine. Meth almost, not complete, but almost disappeared. And I think if we really have the will, we can eliminate this problem, at least as far as methamphetamine goes.
I've taken my name out of the running for drug czar, so.
My name is Gavin White. I'm a city club member. I'm also the chair of the Multnomah County Democrats. Enforcement properly applied can be an effective tool with which to introduce a momentary break in abuse. But research seems to show that deterrents are of little use in prevention. Reducing supply is great, but you'll reach a point of diminishing returns. In light of the overwhelming number of people using meth and the eventual marginal utility of treatment, a comprehensive approach seems to demand an attempt to reduce demand on a broader scale. What's being done, what can be done to reduce demand without relying on deterrence? Would you use the European harm reduction approach as a model? And if not, why not? What would you use as a model and why?
I think, be careful how I word this, but I think harm reduction in the sense of not necessarily in the loaded political sense or connotation it's taken on in this country, measuring the reduction in harm to society makes sense as a barometer of effective drug policy. What we've found, though, what the Oregonian has found and reported is that that supply reduction actually can reduce use. I mean, that users respond. Users do not, demand can be curtailed. And so typically harm reduction is referred to as sort of often disparages the role of law enforcement. But really the empirical question is, well, does law enforcement succeed in raising price and causing demand to recede? And in this one case, we do have evidence for that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a role for treatment and education, but in terms of these dramatic swings and increases and declines in meth use during the 1990s, you don't see that in correlation with like increased or reduced funding for treatment. You do see that in changes in supply.
First of all, I think to say that there is a questionable utility for treatment is wrong.
Not questionable. I'm just saying that some people don't respond to treatment.
That's true, but it's important that we get out there because there is the other rumor running around about methamphetamine is it's not treatable. And what we need to get out there is, let's say we take conservatively that a third of people enter long-term recovery after a treatment episode. I think in Oregon, the average number of episodes is 5 before people enter treatment, but we look at it as sort of a cumulative experience. Each time they come in, you build on what you had before. If a third of people at one agency, say the 5,000 clients we serve, get better, then I would say that reducing users by 1,500 in one program a year is a worthy investment. And we need to stop looking at those that don't make it as the markers for the utility of treatment. Those are the ones the judges see over and over again, the child welfare people see over and over again, the prosecutors see over and over again. But let's look to the successes and build on that. I would say to you that if we invest in this treatment continuum, which includes law enforcement, and we do it right, then we can increase those outcomes. What is totally and wholly unfair to me seems unfair to me, is that outcomes are being demanded of appropriately, evidence-based practices are being demanded appropriately, professionalizing this field appropriately, while the money's been cut 70% across every funding source. So if you want better outcomes, invest in the product and we'll get them, but meantime, let's acknowledge the incredible outcomes that are coming out of these treatment continuums anyway.
I think also if you are able to achieve short-term success, even if there is relapse, if you're measuring kind of the cumulative, effect over 10 years, if there are spells where people are not using drugs, those are spells when they're not committing crimes or hurting their families or themselves.
Oh, perfect. I just wanted to say that, like, during a pregnancy, that's harm reduction we all need to buy into. If a baby's born drug-free and they have a chance at a healthy life, even if the mother relapses, that's a benchmark we need to see as a success.
Absolutely.
And I would say one thing, just economically, treatment makes sense. Multnomah County has been running a drug court program for 15 years. We've run about 9,000 individuals through that. you know, it's as effective as law enforcement, as jail, but it's so much cheaper to run these people through our drug treatment program. It just, on economic basis alone, it makes sense.
I'm afraid we have time for just one more question with a series of answers.
Chris Sullivan, I want to thank you for all your efforts and pointing our attention to the children who are affected. I was a Washington County CASA, and that was my inspiration to eventually get in the Early Childhood Care and Education Committee, research committee here at City Club. I wanted to point out that the Wayne Holder report that the legislature used to consider funding found that the most important step to deal with these children and the neglect that's going on was to reduce the caseload each caseworker handles. That didn't happen. Furthermore, I want to point out that treatment is one option, prevention is another, and Healthy Start dollars were cut by $4 million.
Question, please.
The question that I have is, what, with funding being at issue here, how do we engage the public to recognize that we need to put more resources into funding not only prevention or treatment, but prevention?
The debate over prevention and treatment has been ongoing since I can remember, and they're, like law enforcement and treatment, they're important parts of the same continuum. However, I have been sometimes considered harshly viewing this process when I've said that prevention efforts are essentially useless to the 15% of kids who are going to develop a problem, many of whom come out of homes that are using. That the best primary prevention is to clean those parents up. And that is why the model across Oregon is emerging and should be continued to treat entire families in treatment and not cause kids to move from one foster care placement to the other and lose the ability to attach and bond and grow up to be the next generation of abusing parents. So while I see there's a part for it, and I truly do, for the 85% of kids who will experiment and come out, we can shorten the curve, maybe prevent some from doing it. But for that section, that group of people who will develop a problem if we don't intervene, the best way is to get them born drug-free, raised in clean and sober homes.
I would agree.
That's what I like it.
Did you have a final comment? Well, I want to thank our panel very much, and Greg, thank you for those very good questions as well. And I want to remind you that next week we're at the Benson. Thank you for attention, and we are adjourned.